tattletales, and smashing some babies on some rocks all today on an episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Ezra chapter 4, 5, and 6, and also Psalm 137. And tomorrow we're going to jump over into the book of Haggai and do chapter 1 and 2 of that book. So let's get started with this. These tattletales, as we say. Chapter 4, this is opposition to rebuilding the temple. We're picking up pretty much where we left off yesterday, and opposition to rebuilding the city of Jerusalem as well. Now, the author's description of those who offered to help with the construction here right off the bat as enemies shows that their offer to help wasn't really what it seemed to be. When I first read it, I thought, well, they're offering to help, and these Jews here, they're just, I don't know, they're just ungrateful. They don't want their help. What's the deal with that? Well, their identity is clarified in that they had been brought here by King Esar-Haddon of Assyria. Now, the claim of these enemies that they also worshipped your God was actually probably true, but the problem here was that these people actually worshiped the God of Israel along with other false gods that were around that homeland area. And we learned about that in 2 Kings chapter 17 verses 3 through 22. Now, if Zerubbabel here had allowed these people to help in the construction, it would be impossible to prevent them from worshiping there as well, and also worshiping other idols and other gods there at their temple, the temple of the Lord. So Zerubbabel and the other returnees knew very well the terrible price that their nation had already paid for those sinful practices, and they could never allow such a thing to happen again. So the answer was clearly absolutely not, never, absolutely not. So there was this opposition when we get into verse 4 and 5 here. And the opposition basically bribed officials to be against the Jews here, or the people of people of Judah here, to rebuild these. Now the author here, you got to keep this in mind when you're reading the book of Ezra. Ezra was not really written in a chronological sequence to be a historical document. There were many of these stories were written to be thematic stories. They were thematic accounts of what happened as opposed to chronological accounts to what happened. So as a history major and a history buff, this kind of bothers me when I read thematic depictions of stories, because I say, oh no, that didn't happen. That happened over here. Well, now they're saying this. They wrote a letter to this king, but this king ain't even alive. Well, he's alive, but he doesn't even become king for 50 more years. Why are they writing to this king first, and then they write to a king that back here in this time frame? Then they write to a king in that. You're gonna get so tangled up in the details that you're gonna miss the purpose of the story. So put all that aside, all you history buffs and your timeline aficionados. Put all that behind you and think of this as just a thematic story, and you're going to get the gist of it. So here we are in this thematic account, not chronological, right? So this guy Ahasuerus, he was actually identified as various individuals by a bunch of different scholars, but nearly everybody today identifies him as Xerxes, who lived from 486 to 465 BC. He was the son of Darius, so he's later on down the road. And Xerxes is mentioned actually nowhere else in the Old Testament except for the book of Esther, where he plays a very central role there. Another letter was written to thwart the plans of the returned exiles, this time to Artaxerxes, who took the throne following the death of his father Xerxes, which was later. So here they are writing this letter to him, to Tattletale, saying, look at these Jews, look what they're doing. They're over here building the temple back. They ain't supposed to be doing that. They're going to do this. They're going to build this wall up. They ain't going to pay their taxes. You can look at the history books and you can tell this is bad news. What are you going to do? And it says here that Artaxerxes replied, and he replied pretty quickly. Due to the efficiency of the Persian administration at that time, The letters would have traveled between Samaria and the Persian king in about a week's time period. And that's not bad. Sometimes I've mailed letters and they've taken more than a week to deliver in today's age. So anyway, he sees this letter and he's like, "Oh yeah, you're right. This is bad news. Let's issue an order for these dudes to stop building this temple. They're not going to build it." So they immediately went to the Jews in Jerusalem and forcibly stopped them from building this temple. So we get to chapter 5 at this point. Now, chapter 5. We're here with King Darius of Persia, right? And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And they prophesied to the Jews here that Zerubbabel and Jeshua, they began to rebuild God's temple and God's house in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were there along with them, all helping them to do this job. And the people here and the governor come to them and say, "Who gave you the order to rebuild this temple in this city? What are the names of the workers who are constructing this building?" So they tell them, and they write it down. And then guess what? Tattle. Guess what the Jerusalem folks are doing again? Look what these people from Judah are doing. They write this letter to Darius. And they explain to him, "Darius, listen, brother, here's what's happening. It has been built with cut stones. It's being built right now. Their work is being done diligently, and they're succeeding with it." So we asked them these questions, and here's what they said. They gave this answer that says, "Look, King Cyrus told us we could. He sent us here to do it. So that's why we're doing this." You can look in your history books. You can look in your archives, and you can look it up. So go look it up and get back to us and let us know what you find. So they go out, they look for this, and they go look for themselves, and they find it in the archives, the Cyrus decree, the decree of King Cyrus that said, yes, you will. So we get here into chapter 6. And what happens? But Darius says, look, I found this, that it is true. King Cyrus actually did do this. We didn't find it where it was supposed to be, though, because it got misplaced. And we did find it, though, in this fortress of Ecbatana in the province of Media. And we found the scroll that had the decree of Cyrus written on it. Sure enough, they ain't lying. It says they are supposed to. So Darius writes this decree and says, y'all stay away from that place. You leave them alone. Leave the construction of the house of God alone. Let the governor, the elders, and the Jews rebuild this house of God on its own original site. Y'all stay out of their business. This is their business, not your business anymore. So the cost to be paid in full to these men out of the royal revenues from the taxes of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that the work will never stop. Whatever is needed. In other words, he's saying, look, not only are you going to leave them alone, we're paying for them to build this too. We're going to give them the money, the bulls, the rams, the lambs, the burnt offering, whatever it is, the wheat, the salt, the wine, whatever they need, we giving it to them, and so they can use it to get the job done. That's what's going to happen. The house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. And you know exactly when that is, don't you? That was March the 12th of 515 BC when they completed it. And then they did a temple dedication and a Passover. So at this point, we're going to move on to Psalm 137. And in verse 9, it says it right here. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. You know, this is one of those moments where you take one verse out of the Bible out of context and you just read it by itself and you're like, what in the world is the Bible talking about killing babies and smashing them against rocks? Why in the world would the Bible say to do something like this? Well, this is that moment where you can't just read a verse and take it out of context and make it what you want it to be. Don't ever do that. Always read in context. So, Psalm 137 is a lament of the exiles, according to the CSB, and in the New King James Version, the title here is Longing for Zion in a Foreign Land. Now, it starts out saying, by the rivers of Babylon that were sat down, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Now, these rivers of Babylon were a series of canals that were running through the southern plain. Now, during the exile, the assembled community used to go there to grieve through these rivers, these canals that they called rivers, but they were just canals. In verse 3, Israel's captors were tormenting and mocking them, and they were pretty distraught about it. In verse 4, the Israelites could not engage in worship since the land of Babylon was unclean and Israel didn't have any temple there, and they weren't allowed to make their sacrifices anywhere but on the temple. So they were in a mess of a state. They were very depressed, thus this lament. And we get to verse 8 and 9 here. In verse 8 it says, daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who pays you back what you have done to us. Now, this is actually a theme, and this is actually a law in Jewish law. Who pays you back what you have done to us reinforces this concept of people receiving a punishment that is equal to their crime. That eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth thing, right? That we learned about in Exodus 21, and also we hear again about in Matthew chapter 5. Well, God is the one that pays those back who reject him in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and chapter 32, and even in Isaiah 65. So this concept of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing is pretty realistic, but is for judges when they're doing judgment, not for people to go out and do on their own. So that's the catch here. So Babylon, they wanted specifically for Babylon to be repaid for the crimes against their people. And this very startling verse here, chapter Psalm 137 verse 9, I mean, to me, I was stunned when I read it, but this was written out of intense emotion. It was kind of seething with righteous anger as well, and he called for the execution of just vengeance against the wicked people who had very perhaps they may very well have done this exact same thing to them and killed babies of the Israelites. So that's what he's talking about here. He's not saying, hey, y'all run out and grab some babies and fling them up against a rock. That's not what they're saying. They're saying eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. These bad guys have done this to us. Now it's our turn. God do this to them. There we go. That's what I have for you today. So, what'd you think? I hope this has touched you in some way and helped your studying. If it has, click that like button, that subscribe button. Of course, click a little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And also hit that little boxing glove so you can rumble with me on Rumble. And we will see you next time for another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. I see you then.